Welcome, early American literature friends. This is a guide through chapters 1, 2, and 5 of Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And what I want to do in this is give you just a very brief introduction to Frederick Douglass, the person, and then guide you through these first chapters. We're skipping chapters 3 and 4 because what they really do, they're useful and interesting chapters about Frederick Douglass's early life up until the age of 7. Chapter 5 gets us to age 7 and gets him away from the plantation where he is born, Colonel Lloyd's plantation, which is really like 5 or 6 farms all put together into this giant plantation with several hundred slaves. This is where Frederick Douglass is born. It is on the eastern shore of Maryland, the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay, because when he goes to Baltimore, the ship sails up and across the Chesapeake Bay to away from the plantation where he is born over to Baltimore. I want to talk, like I said, very briefly. When Frederick Douglass dies, this is the first. He writes 3 memoirs or autobiographies, whatever you want to call them, of his life over the course of his life. But this is the first one. This is the most famous one. This is the one that really tells the story. What he's really telling the story of here is his life growing up, his experiences with slavery, and then leading up to his escape. That's what this tells the story of. Because the later autobiographies tell and retell different parts of this story, but they also focus on his later life after he escapes and those kinds of things. In these first chapters, the chapters we are dealing with, 1, 2, and 5, what they do is tell the story of his early life, his childhood, up to age 7. And it's at age 7 that he is chosen to go to Baltimore. You see Douglass later in his life here. I just wanted to bring this part up because he is born in somewhere in 1817 or 1818. Roughly in February, it's towards the end of winter. He is able to determine later, after the Civil War, he is able to determine through bookkeeping records from the plantation where he was born that he was born in February. In either 1817 or 1818, he is on the roll as a piece of property by 1818. He dies in February 20th, 1895. By the time he dies, he is by far and away the most famous African-American activist for civil rights. He becomes friends with Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War and is an important advocate both for African American rights and for women's rights after the Civil War. He becomes a friend to the cause of suffrage after the Civil War. This book, though, tells the story of, like I said, it tells the story of his young life, of his experiences in slavery, and then he escapes at some point in his later teenage years when he escapes from slavery. And so this book is really covering that. We're starting when he's born in 1817, 1818, and then getting into the early 1820s because he's around 7 years old when he goes to Baltimore. So I'm going to dive into chapter 1. There's a photo of him when he is younger. Here's the photo of him when he is younger in his early 20s. So that gives you a better sense of what he looked like. Not as a child, as he's describing in these chapters, but at least when he's younger. So let's dive. The other thing that's worth mentioning before we do that, wanted to point out, Frederick Douglass's book is by far and away the most famous of the American slave narratives. Slave narratives are biographical and autobiographical. This obviously autobiographical stories about the experience of slavery and often escaping from it, which is what this book gives you as well. Beginning in 1789, the first American slave narrative is Olaudah Equiano's interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano. Equiano, though, is brought. Equiano tells the story of being brought from the coast. He is kidnapped, brought to the coast of Africa, and then brought eventually to South Carolina. And continuing through the Works Progress Administration collection of oral narratives of the last few surviving slaves in the 1930s. In the 1930s, most of the slaves who had survived and were still alive from the Civil War, people who could remember, who had lived through and could remember that experience, they were mostly dead by the time you get to the 1930s. And so the Works Progress Administration, Great Depression program from President Roosevelt captured some of those last slave narratives. There's a whole, University of North Carolina's slave narrative collection and Washington State both have lengthy explanations of slave narratives and documentation of there's several thousand, they're like roughly 6,000 American slave narratives if you're interested in more information. But like I said, Douglas's is by far and away the most famous because he rose to such fame in the 1860s, 1870s, based on this book and then the other speeches and books that he wrote later on. Chapter 1, he gives you the basics of his birth, his sort of understanding of who his mother was, his father, but also how he had no connection to them. He begins right here. I was born in Tuckahoe near Hillsboro, about 12 miles from Easton in Talbot County, Maryland. This is, like I said, on the eastern shore, on this sort of fertile farmland. He tells you later in the book what they grow, which is this mix of corn, wheat, and tobacco. He talks in that first paragraph, by far the larger part of slaves know little of their ages, as horses know of theirs, and it is the wish of most masters to keep their slaves ignorant. I do not remember to have ever met a slave who could tell of his birthday. And he tells you the best slaves could ever get was like, I was born during planting time, or during the winter, or during harvest time, which would have been born during the fall. The nearest estimate I can give makes me now between 27 and 28 years of age. And again, when he wrote this book, he didn't have the information that he got later about from the documentation from the plantation. He talks about his mother. His mother was named Harriet Bailey, but he has no connection and no attachment because he is a part of what is often practice for slaves is pretty soon after they are born, a few weeks to a few months, maybe as long as 6 months, but maybe as quickly as 2 or 3 weeks. He is separated from his mother. She works at a different farm, a nearby farm, and he was given to what they would call a mammy, which was often a older African American woman who was too old or perhaps too weak to work, and so she became the nanny for most of the slave babies. He talks about how part of this, one of the reasons for this, is to sever family connections between African Americans, give them less of a family connection and family community. He gives you this description, this really sad description of how prior to his mother dying, he only saw her a few times. She would come after she finished her day of work, she would come put him to sleep and then walk all the way back home 5-6 miles. She died when I was 7 years old on one of my master's farms near Lee's Mill. She was long gone before I knew anything about it. I received the tidings of her death with much the same emotions I could have probably felt at the death of a stranger. So like, what he's giving you right here is that he has no family connection, especially to his parents. That section I just read, I should have probably felt at the death of a stranger. The only family connection he ever has is to his grandmother, and he explains that connection later in the story when she is essentially retired and like shunted away to a cabin. He says there's one of the famous chapters from this section though is the whisper that my master was my father. This would be Captain Aaron. Anthony is his father. It is of but little consequence to my purpose, while the fact remains in all of its glaring odiousness that slaveholders have ordained and by law established, and this was law in the South, that the children of slave women shall in all cases follow the condition of their mothers. This is done to administer to their own lusts and make a gratification of their wicked desires profitable as well as pleasurable. If you don't understand what he's saying here, it was a law all over the South that if you were born to a free person, you were free. If you were born to a slave person, you were a slave. And what Douglas is saying is, what this does is when masters essentially rape or sexually abuse their female slaves, and those female slaves then become pregnant and give birth, what it does is, this is where he gets pleasurable as well as profitable. They get the pleasure of raping the female slaves, but then the profit of producing, because the condition of the mother determines the condition of the children. They get the pleasure and then the profit of generating more slaves, is the point that Douglas is making. He gives you this next paragraph where he talks about how like often these slaves who are the children of masters have to be sold away because they are offensive both to the master and to the master's wife, because it is this obvious evidence that the master has had sex with one of the female slaves, but also it prevents the white children from having to whip the biracial or mixed race children, and so they sell those children. You also get one of the other famous paragraphs in this first chapter is this paragraph. Every year brings with it a multitude of this class of slaves, and he means these biracial or mixed racial children. It is doubtless the consequence of a knowledge of this fact that one great statesman of the South predicted the downfall of slavery by the inevitable laws of population. And he says, it is nevertheless plain that a very different looking class of people are springing up at the South and are now held in slavery from those originally brought to this country in Africa. And if their increase can do no other good, it will do away the force of the argument that God cursed Ham and therefore American slavery is right. If you don't understand the point that he is making here, he is saying that there's really two parts to this, the different class of people. He is saying that the people who came from Africa were black people, just in terms of their physical appearance. And all of this interracial relationships have produced a class of people who physically look different because they're not so black anymore. They've produced this biracial mixed race brown people. And then he references one of the common arguments that was used in support of American slavery, which is it is this biblical reference to Ham, who is a descendant of, I believe, of Noah in the Christian Old Testament. What the Ham reference gives you is, it is a reference to Ham is cursed by God as one of Noah's children for this complicated set of reasons. And Ham is, in biblical mythology, Ham is cursed by God and sent into the wilderness to wander. And the understanding was that the wilderness is then he goes into Africa, and he is the ancestor of all of the peoples of Africa. And so slavery was right because it is part of this ongoing curse of Ham that was created by God. It is a nonsensical argument, but it was used at the time, obviously a nonsensical argument, but it was used at the time to justify American slavery. Douglas's point here is, well, fine, if that's your argument, these people who exist now, they are not strictly descendants of Ham, and so your argument is weakened, if not outright wrong, or it's flawed, if not outright failed at this point, because of all this racial intermixing that has happened. He goes farther and says, I have had two masters. He talks about Captain Anthony. Captain Anthony is his master until he is around 2 years old. Captain Anthony is the captain of the ship that transports goods from the plantation back and forth to Annapolis and Baltimore across the Chesapeake Bay. Captain Anthony, he says, owns about 30 slaves, so much less. And Captain Anthony is the overseer of the overseers. So he is the boss. Each farm on the plantation has its own overseer. Captain Anthony is the boss of all of the individual overseers, and also the suggestion here is the accountant or something like that, the bookkeeper of the entire farm, the entire plantation, and all the farms on it. Chapter 1 ends, and it gives you this description of Frederick Douglass's aunt, whose name is Aunt Hester, and who Captain Anthony very clearly is interested in having a sexual relationship with. The suggestion in the book is that he rapes her multiple times, but it's never explicitly said. What is explicitly said is, what you do explicitly get is this very violent description of how Aunt Hester is forbidden from being out after dark, and doubly forbidden from being out after dark and then being with this other slave who belongs to Colonel Lloyd, who owns the entire plantation, who would be Captain Anthony's boss. And the suggestion is that Aunt Hester is this very attractive woman. You get this description where he says, she was a woman of noble form and of graceful proportions, having very few equals and fewer superiors. So what Frederick Douglass is trying to say here is Aunt Hester is very, very attractive, both physically pretty and physically attractive. And so it's easy to understand why Captain Anthony wanted to keep her from getting out and doing what she wanted to do and having relationships with the people she wanted to have a relationship with, because he wanted to keep her home all to himself to sexually assault. She is discovered not only out when she's supposed to be in at night, but with the person that she has a relationship with, whose name is Ned Roberts, And because of that, Douglas gives you this description of this incident that he witnesses where Aunt Hester, to be punished, is tied up to a ceiling joist. Her hands are tied, and then she is hooked onto a meat hook. She's made to stand on a stool. Her tied hands are hooked onto a meat hook in the ceiling joist, and then her shirt is taken off, and she is whipped by Captain Anthony. Aunt Hester had not only disobeyed his orders in going out, but had been found in company with Lloyd's Ned. Before he commits to whipping Aunt Hester, he took her into the kitchen, stripped her from neck to waist, leaving her neck, shoulders, and back entirely naked. He told her to cross her hands, calling her, the suggestion here is damn bitch. After crossing her hands, he tied them with a strong rope, led her to a stool under a large hook in the joist put in for this purpose. He made her get on the stool, tied her hands to the hook. He then whips her until she bleeds. Frederick Douglass witnesses this whole incident, and then the most famous sentence from this sequence is, "I was so terrified and horror-stricken at the sight that I hid myself in a closet, dared not venture out till long after the bloody transaction was over. I expected it would be my turn next. It was all new to me. I'd never seen anything like it." And he says, he calls it it was the bloodstained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery through which I was about to pass. That's one of the most famous sentences in this chapter. So what he ends this chapter with is this description of the beginning of sort of the horrors and the physical violence of slavery. And that gives you, chapter 1 gives you two parts: his sort of birth and first recognition of his situation, and then the beginning of his understanding of himself and the horrors of slavery. Chapter 2 gives you this explanation of his owner. My master's family consisted of 2 sons and 1 daughter, Lucretia, and her husband, Captain Thomas Auld. That's important because Frederick Douglass eventually belongs to Lucretia, the daughter, and because of her marriage belongs to Captain Thomas Auld, who is the captain of the ship that goes between the plantation and Baltimore. And so ultimately, when he goes to Baltimore, he goes there to belong to Captain Thomas Auld's brother, whose name is Hugh Auld. When he goes to Baltimore, he is the property of Lucretia, who is Captain Anthony's daughter, and then through her marriage, the property of her husband, Captain Thomas Auld. And Thomas Auld sends Douglass to live with his brother, whose name is Hugh Auld. Hugh and Sophia Auld are those people. Chapter 2 doesn't get you that far, but it's important to remember those people, because later there is this sort of like Captain Anthony dies, and then Lucretia dies, and there is this like dispute over where Frederick Douglass is going to be and who he technically belongs to. What he gives you in chapter 2 is this description of Colonel Lloyd kept from 300 to 400 slaves on his home plantation. Chapter 2 is valuable because it gives you a description of the basic physical conditions. I'm going to see if I can scroll down here, because there is a paragraph. Here it is, right here's the next paragraph. The slaves of all the other farms received their monthly allowance of food and their yearly clothing. This chapter is important because it gives you descriptions of the basic living conditions of the slaves on this plantation. This paragraph deals with the monthly allowance of food, and he says 8 pounds of pork or its equivalent in fish, and 1 bushel of cornmeal. That's what the slaves got to survive a month on that food. Their yearly clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts, a pair of linen trousers, shirts, 1 jacket, a pair of trousers for winter made of coarse Negro cloth. This is like rough linen is what he's describing, or rough, unrefined cotton. A pair of trousers for winter, the whole of which could not have cost more than $7. The allowance of the slave children until they are around 7 years old and are old at 7 or 8 and are old enough to work, basically all they get is a long night shirt, a shirt that would come down to their knees, no shoes, no nothing. And when these failed them, they went naked until the next allowance day. Children from 7 to 10 years old of both sexes, almost naked, might be seen at all seasons of the year. So in the cold of winter or the heat of summer, you get 1 shirt a year, and when it wears out, you're probably just running around naked. There were no beds given to the slaves unless 1 coarse blanket might be considered such, and none but the men and women had these. So he's talking about in the slave quarters, the men and women slept on the ground. They got 1 blanket to cover themselves with. So he is basically giving you this description of the really difficult living conditions of the average slave who works on a plantation. You know, the limited amount of food they get, the limited amount of clothing they get. Their sleeping, their living and sleeping situation when they're not out in the fields working. The whole. Then he gives you a description of the two overseers. Mr. Severe is the first one. Mr. Severe was rightly named. He was a cruel man. About how he whips people so viciously, how he curses and yells at people, and is just an awful overseer. And then eventually he dies. Mr. Severe's place is filled by Mr. Hopkins. He's a very different man, less cruel, less profane, made less noise than Mr. Severe. His course was characterized by no extraordinary demonstration of cruelty. He whipped, but seemed to take no pleasure in it. He was called by the slaves a good overseer. And so you get this description. Again, this is another part of their physical living conditions, because this is the person who's in charge of them. They have one very cruel overseer, and then Mr. Hopkins is less cruel. And this chapter ends with a description of the slaves how they would go get their monthly allowance of food and supplies from the home plantation, what is called the Great House Farm in this book, which would be where Colonel Lloyd, who owns all the plantations, all the slaves from all the farms would come to the Great House Farm to get their monthly allowances, because that leads you into Frederick Douglass's description of slave songs, and how as they're walking to the woods, walking to the Great House Farm from the other farms, they would be singing these slave songs. There is this long tradition in slavery and African American culture that eventually leads to the invention of blues and rock and roll in the early 20th century. All of that comes from slave songs and slave spirituals and slave work chants, the call and response work chants. All of that eventually leads to the creation of the blues and rock and roll in the 1920s and 1930s. Douglass gives you this. The slave select. It's the next paragraph. I'm sorry. I did not, when a slave, understand the deep meaning of these rude and apparently incoherent songs. I was myself within the circle, so I neither saw nor heard of those who might see and hear. I have often been utterly astonished since I came to the North to find persons who could speak of the singing among slaves as evidence of their contentment and happiness. It is impossible to conceive of a greater mistake. And Douglass makes the argument that when slaves sing, whether they are working or walking through the woods to go get their supplies and their monthly allowance, his point is slaves don't sing because they're happy. They sing because it is this method of like therapy and a coping mechanism where they sort of sing about the hardships of their lives and their sorrows, and hoping to be released from those like sorrows and conditions either in this life or the next. He makes this argument that slave songs are this sort of release, this sort of pressure release valve, and this sort of like stress release. That is one of the ways that slaves deal with and manage the sort of stress and hardships and toils, because it is a way of expressing those sorrows and hardships and toils. And that is what you get, especially in this last paragraph of chapter 2. We jump past chapter 3 and chapter 4. I'm going to scroll down to get us to chapter 5 here. There's chapter 4. Again, just it's all interesting, but it's all descriptions of life on the farm when Douglass was a child. And because what he gives you in chapter 5 is, after all this general information, as to my own treatment while I lived on Colonel Lloyd's plantation, it was very similar to that of the other slave children. And again, when he goes to Baltimore, he is just getting close to the age where he would go out into the field and work. And so he avoids that life until he is, as a teenager, eventually brought back from Baltimore to work on the farm. But that's when he's 14, 15, 16. And this first paragraph tells you he never really had to do any hard work. He says, the most I had to do was drive up the cows at evening, keep the fowls out of the garden, keep the front yard clean, run errands for my old master's daughter, Miss Lucretia, who becomes his technical owner, and then her husband owns Frederick Douglass because of their marriage. I spent most of my leisure time I spent in helping Master Daniel Lloyd finding his birds after he had shot them, so he'd help with the bird hunting. I was seldom whipped by my old master. So Frederick Douglass, and this would be true of most slave children up until they were 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, they would not go under, they would not deal with any kind of especially the brutal physical violence that field slaves often dealt with. What he says is, His biggest problems as a child on the plantation are cold and hunger. And he describes how being so cold in the winter that he would get frostbite on his feet. He would crawl inside of a cornmeal bag to try to stay warm during the winter time. He also gives you this description in the paragraph where he says, we were not regularly allowanced. Our food was coarse cornmeal boiled. This would be something like grits or cream of wheat, if you've ever had that food, is what he's describing. He talks about the food for the children is just poured into this big tray or trough, and all the children run and eat either with their hands or with wooden shingles that you would use for siding. The children were then called like so many pigs. Some would eat with oyster shells, others with pieces of shingle, some with naked hands, none with spoons. He that ate fastest got most, he that was strongest secured the best place, and few left the trough satisfied. So he says, like, all the kids ate out of this trough. Most of the kids, or all of the kids, never got quite enough or all that they wanted to eat. When Frederick, I was probably between 7 and 8 years old when I left Colonel Lloyd's plantation. The suggestion is, the best you can read out of this is that because he is friends with the master's son, the person who he talks about collecting the birds, helping Master Daniel Lloyd, because of his close connection to Daniel Lloyd, he is the one who is chosen to go to Baltimore. I shall never forget the ecstasy with which I received the intelligence that my old master had determined to let me go to Baltimore to live with Mr. Hugh Auld, brother to my old master's son-in-law, Captain Thomas Auld. So that is his owner's son-in-law, Thomas Auld's brother, Hugh Auld, is the person who lives in Baltimore, and that's where he goes. I spent most of the part of these 3 days in the creek, washing off the plantation scurf and preparing myself for my departure. And he gets his first pair of pants to get to go to Baltimore. He gives you this description of it. And he says the really important part of this middle section of chapter 5 is he talks about when he leaves, he does not feel sorry at all. He feels no connection to home. He doesn't really feel any connection. It's not like he's leaving a mom or dad that he loves and that loves him, because he doesn't have that. He feels like he's going to miss his grandmother, but that's really all you get. He talks about the trip, which takes all day Saturday, and then he gets to Baltimore on Sunday morning. That section begins. We sailed out of Miles River for Baltimore on a Saturday morning, which is right here. I remember only the day of the week. They get to Baltimore. We arrived at Baltimore early on Sunday morning, landing at Smith's Wharf, and then one of the slaves who works on the boat takes him to Hugh and Sophia Auld's house. Mr. and Mrs. Auld were both at home and met me at the door with their little son Thomas, to take care of whom I've been given. This is going to be Frederick Douglass's main job in Baltimore, is to take care of Hugh and Sophia Auld's son, who is a year or two younger than Frederick Douglass. He's 4, 5, 6 years old. Here I saw what I'd never seen before, a white face beaming with the most kindly emotions. It was the face of my new mistress, Sophia Auld. She becomes important to Frederick Douglass because Hugh and Sophia Auld have never owned a slave, so they are this sort of test subject for him about how owning slaves poisons is awful, obviously, for slaves, but also poisons white people, and how slavery is this poisonous system that poisons everybody involved. I wish I could describe the rapture that flashed through my soul as I beheld it, a new and strange sight to me, brightening up my pathway. Little Thomas was told there was his Freddie, and I was told to take care of little Thomas, and thus I entered upon the duties of my new home. And then the last 2 paragraphs of chapter 5 talk about Frederick Douglass's sense that he was always going to escape slavery one way or another, and that it was this sort of God's will that he has chosen. The most famous, I look upon my departure from Colonel Lloyd's plantation as one of the most interesting events of my life. And he says in this paragraph that had he not been chosen to go to Baltimore, he would most likely still be a slave, be a field slave at the plantation. Going to live at Baltimore laid the foundation and opened the gateway to all my subsequent prosperity. I regard the selection of myself as being somewhat remarkable. I may be deemed superstitious and even egotistical in regarding this event as a special interposition of divine providence in my favor. That's the God chose me. Divine providence is like the will of God being acted out in this world. And so what he is saying here, it was God's will or God's choice to choose me to be the one who got chosen to go to Baltimore. In his later life and in his later autobiographies, he focuses less on this idea that he was special and he was chosen, and he argues more that it was just kind of dumb luck that he was the one who was chosen. But obviously, when he is young, he connects his sort of feeling that he was going to escape and not going to be a slave forever, and this sort of, it was God's choice, God chose him, that he was special. That is where chapter 5 ends, though, with him being the one who is chosen and with him getting to Baltimore. And so when we go forward in the next chapters, we'll talk about his experience in Baltimore, his life there, and why he is eventually forced to go back to the plantation. He goes back to the plantation, then back to Baltimore, and then eventually back to the plantation when he is 15, 16 years old. But he spends roughly at least the next 7 years or so in Baltimore. He learns to read in Baltimore, but these first 5 chapters give you his experience of his first roughly 7 years of his life on the plantation, and then get him to Baltimore. I hope that was useful in helping you to understand these sections. These sections are also pretty easy to read, especially compared to the first few things we read, like John Smith and William Bradford. They're relatively short chapters. They're much easier to read. And so hopefully they're easy to read and understand for you. What I'm trying to do in these videos is pull out important moments and events and details, like the Aunt Hester being whipped and things like that. Again, I hope that was useful to you and helpful to you.